Modern political discourse is flooded with movements claiming to fight for liberation, justice, and equality. Organizations like Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and various anti-Islamophobia groups position themselves as the ultimate shields against tyranny. However, a glaring deception lies at the heart of their activism. While they claim to combat fascism, they do not merely resemble it, they are fascists. Fascism is defined not by the slogans on a banner, but by the boot that steps on a dissenter's neck. By relying on physical violence, enforcing absolute ideological conformity, and demanding state-enforced censorship, and weaponizing societal scapegoats, these movements meet every functional definition of fascism. A foundational benchmark of fascism is the creation of a unified scapegoat, a collective enemy blamed for all society's ills. Historically, the targets were defined. Nazi Germany targeted Jews, and Mussolini's Italy weaponized hatred against communists to unify the state. Today's radical left-wing movements deploy exact same psychological mechanism, merely changing the identity of the target. Complex societal problems are reduced to a primitive us versus them binary. Entire groups of people, labeled broadly as the privileged, oppressors, ideologically non-compliant dissenters, are cast as the modern scapegoat. By systematically dehumanizing these desired enemies, these movements create an environment where public shaming, social ruin, and street-level violence are celebrated as moral imperatives. This scapegoating is fueled by a rigid worldview rooted in blind ideology and profound ignorance. Both historical fascism and modern radical left-wing movements are bound by an inability to experience self-doubt. Driven by high emotionalism rather than rational analysis, they are entirely incapable of understanding or empathizing with the motivations of the people they hate. In fact, these modern groups know almost nothing about actual fascism. They simply weaponize the term as a slur to describe anyone they disagree with. This ignorance serves a tactical purpose. By labeling an opponent evil, they create a self-justifying license to bypass the legal system entirely. They do not seek solutions through the law. Instead, they operate on the premise that evil must be eradicated by any means necessary. For the fascist, ideology always overrules legality. This total rejection of the law manifests as raw political violence and on our streets, the definitive hallmark of fascism. Historically, Mussolini's black shirts used physical brutality to dominate public spaces and terrorize political opponents into silence. Today, groups like Antifa and allied anti-racists, so-called quote-unquote, factions use identical paramilitary tactics under the guise of community defense. A stark example of this occurred recently in London, where a street speaker was violently attacked by a mob and subsequently aided by activists from the movement Stand Up to Racism. When a movement uses shields or justifies physical force to achieve political ends, it is not a peaceful advocacy group. It is a fascist paramilitary organization using the fists to enforce compliance. Finally, this fascism is solidified by an absolute intolerance for conversation and an active demand for state censorship. Democratic societies depend on open debate, but these movements reject dialogue because they cannot win an argument on its merits. Instead, They move straight to suppression, lobbying tech platforms, universities, and the government to censor dissent under the pretense of combating hate speech or Islamophobia, quote unquote. They manipulate the principle of free speech to establish their own platforms, only to demand that the state strip that same freedom away from their critics. Too often, those who recognize these societal problems offer no real path forward. They merely point out the rot and declare it, quote unquote, bad. To break this cycle of authoritarianism, society must enact concrete, actionable solutions. These solutions must not be driven by retaliation, but by a philosophy of pacifism, empathy, and a commitment to focusing on the inherent good in people. We counter totalitarian tactics by building a freer, more resilient society through the following actions. Abolish hate speech laws. The primary leverage of modern left-wing fascists is their ability to redefine language. They twist words to mean whatever suits their agenda, yet they lean on the enforcement of the law as if the definitions had never changed. When they target citizens with legal accusations of quote-unquote hate speech, the victim typically reacts defensively because they adhere to the traditional meanings of those words. This weaponized manipulation silences critics and forces them into introspection, creating a false illusion that the fascists have no opposition. Abolishing these overreaching laws immediately strips these ideological actors of their legal power, allowing critics to openly lay bare the falsehoods of their claims. 2. Redefine and disarm the terms. If radical movements insist on redefining words to weaponize them, society must actively strip those words of their leverage. These groups currently act as ideological sentinels of the state, using accusations of hate speech as a tool for intimidation. This intimidation only works because their victims still hold a different, more serious definition of the allegation. By establishing a mutual, transparent understanding of how these terms are being manipulated, the psychological leverage of the accusation completely disappears. 3. Restore total freedom of speech. We must transition back to a system where free speech is absolute, restricting only explicit, immediate calls for physical violence. The long-term societal blueprint must be one of total intellectual freedom, actively teaching and cultivating a society that is no longer afraid of words. When citizens are resilient enough to face opposing ideas without fear, the power of censorship dissolves. 4. Increase physical security and police presence. To directly combat the physical intimidation and street-level violence deployed by these groups, the state must increase the presence of law enforcement on the streets. Protecting public spaces ensures that citizens can gather, speak, and engage in commerce without fear of paramilitary assault, rendering violent intimidation obsolete. Ultimately, an organization must be judged by its actions, not its self-proclaimed labels. While modern radical left-wing movements wrap themselves in the language of anti-fascism, their behavior is unequivocally totalitarian. By replacing weaponized censorship with radical free speech and countering street violence with robust, peaceful legal protection, society can disarm the modern fascist movement. Tyranny is defeated not by copying its hatred, but by replacing its coercion with an unwavering commitment to human liberty.